Good evening to all the participants. I welcome you on behalf of Madras Tax Bar to our 101st webinar. And today we have special guests on the special day of Guru Purnima, where Dr. S. Vaidya Subramaniam and Mr. Amrit Bhargav, advocate, will be taking the session on universities deemed to be redeemed. Before JK sir gives his welcome speech, um, there are a few announcements to be made with regard to the session. If you have any queries, I request you to first send those queries in the chat box to me. Then, depending on the availability of time, we will call up the person who has sent that query and we will take up the question. You can ask the question directly. So I request all the participants to first send in your queries in the chat box and thereafter we will take it up. So we hope to have a wonderful session today with the two great speakers. And to introduce them, I call upon JK sir to tell a few words. Thank you all.
Thank you, Prithvi. As you rightly said, today being Guru Purnima, there is no better speaker than a very eminent educationalist who is going to address this gathering on a very auspicious day. I briefly, because he has put a caveat initially that I should curtail, I should be very brief in introducing him, his laurels and everything. With that limitation, let me proceed. Today we are going to have a speaker who is a Vice Chancellor and also Tata Consultancy Services Chair Professor of Management of a university, which truly represents the word of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said, education should be like intelligence plus character should be the true goal of an education. If that is right, a definition of an education, then Sastra University is an edifice in imparting both intelligence as well as character, with which I am closely associated. I can be a testimony to that. I can be a witness to that because I have recruited people from there. Mr. None other than Dr. S. Vaidya Subramaniam. He is an alumnus of Harvard Business School with a specific interest in public policy and higher education management. He's a doctorate in the area of MBA education in India as a visiting scholar at University of Virginia. He is also an MBA from Asian Institute of Management, Manila, Philippines, and he is also, like Tata Steels, he is also an engineer. He is a BE from Electronics and Instrumentation from the Bharathidasan University. Having put up a great corporate experience with giants like Siemens, Meralco, and Johnson & Johnson, he is also a member in the MHRD committees, CII, ASSOCHAM on higher education and various academic bodies. He has won jointly the Young Manager Award from the Madras Management Association in 1996. He has been a resource person, this is very crucial, in one of the three best institutions of the world, LKY School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore, and also the Asian Development Bank, ADB. He is a member in various academic bodies of various colleges and a regular columnist in New Indian Express, and I have also read his writings occasionally in Times of India and also in Dinamani. He has authored a book called Express Writings, which comprises of 3 great volumes, a book predominantly on the educational policy. With this, I present to this august audience a great educationalist, a fantastic thinker, a very important force in education policy in India, Mr. Dr. S. Vaidya Subramaniam. Welcome, sir. And I also have a co-speaker who is a young Turk whom we all look upon today to have a fine session. He is Amrit Bhargav. He is a junior from a very reputed house of, right now he is from the house of AAG Senior Advocate Arvind Pandian. He is also in the same age, he has also co-authored a book on the 90th celebration of Mr. Parasaran, on a fantastic title. I love that Pitamaha title. He has also been he's doing his doctorate in Sastra University. And welcome, Amrit. We are looking forward for a very, very enlightening session. A completely offbeat for the Madras Tax Bar, but a very, very interesting and an enlightening topic. Welcome on board, sirs. Over to you, Doctor.
Thank you, Mr. Jayakumar, for the generous introduction. So what Amrit and we have planned to do is to kind of lay down a background to this discussion, which is going to be on various dimensions of the issue of deemed universities. And before the session starts that way, I must first thank the Madras Tax Bar for giving both of us the opportunity to address an audience of this type, which is already enlightened enough to scare me. And on this Guru Purnima day, I would like to recall the fundamental characteristic of a teacher is to be of a student first. So on this Guru Purnima day, I would like to be a student and learn more from the audience that is assembled here, and the type of audience that I see in front of the panel is an audience that only organizations like the Madras Tax Bar can assemble. And secondly, I am only a trespasser into this field of law. And usually, trespassing is an offense. But I will just flip it to use this opportunity as a trespasser to defend, as a defense mechanism to remove certain myths and certain issues concerning deemed universities, which in my view, using the words of my close friend, Professor Vaidyanathan, deemed universities have been victims of what he calls rather, terminological terrorism. So deemed universities have been called as doomed universities or damned universities, or all sorts of words used to characterize a very noble concept of deemed universities that Dr. Radhakrishnan envisaged, about which we are going to talk at length. So I will stop here only to hand over the session to Amrit Bhargav. Amrit Bhargav and I will cover various dimensions tracing the genesis of this concept, the legal journey that the concept of deemed universities has undertaken, and the status quo as we see them today, and what lies ahead of the deemed universities as we move forward. And all of this we plan to do in the next 50 minutes, so that the last half an hour is free for questions from the audience. With these few words, I invite Amrit Bhargav to initiate the proceedings.
Sir, thank you for those words of introduction. And it's a privilege to be addressing the Madras Tax Bar on this very interesting subject. And as you already stated, the story of deemed universities or private universities in India is both absorbing and interesting, both legally and historically. The Radhakrishnan Commission, which was appointed just after independence in November-December 1948, chalked out an extensive strategy for education in general and paid a lot of attention to higher education. We must remember that this was a time when it was widely thought about that only a select philanthropy was possible by few very wealthy individuals in higher education, and that higher education, primary education, both of them were the exclusive preserve of the union government or the state government, or the case may be. In fact, the Radhakrishnan report lays down the foundation for private universities, for deemed universities, in the sense that it does say in its own report about the autonomy for universities, and it would make an interesting reading, a small portion for listeners' convenience. Exclusive control of education by the state has been an important factor in facilitating the maintenance of totalitarian tyrannies. In such states, institutions of higher learning controlled and managed by governmental agencies promote the political purposes and make them acceptable to their populations and supply of intellectual weapons. These are the words used by Dr. Radhakrishnan. We must resist, in the interests of our own democracy, the trend towards governmental domination of the educational process. In fact, the report concedes that it is permissible and in fact welcome to have private role in higher education. And this is the seeds of the deemed university model, which of course came in the 50s, later of course during the 80s. The 50s, of course, the UGC Act, the Universities Grants Commission Act, was formulated in 56, which we will be discussing about. And this was also the time when there was a lot of governmental investment in the Indian Institutes of Technology, the regional engineering colleges, the Indian Institutes of Management much later. But this was a time when interest in higher education was running high, and private initiative in higher education was in its infancy and was trying to be cultivated by a few institutions across the country. And moving on, I would like to engage Dr. Vaidya on the ensuing decade, the 60s. What was the environment of higher education, more from an educationist point of view, in terms of student response or the historical stakeholder arrangement which was there? More as a period piece for us to understand.
Yeah, thank you, Amrit. So if we trace back the evolution of higher education in general, before we move to professional education that covers engineering, law, medicine later, the subject of higher education or education was dominated by the state, and rightly so, because it was considered to be a social building endeavor, as a result of which the role of the state was more pronounced and significant pre-independence and post-independence, as a result of which significant investments came from the state, barring a very few exceptions here and there. But things started changing when the world order also changed. That world over, the role of private institutions in education, and more particularly in higher education, started gaining significant momentum. And that is when, as you rightly pointed out, the first Higher Education Commission report, which later we call now as the new educational policy, or the national education policy that we are expecting a new one very soon, came in the form of a great educationist, Dr. Radhakrishnan, in 1948, where he touched almost all dimensions of education, and where the role of private institutions capable of delivering this public social good was significantly highlighted. And he very characteristically differentiated that state aid is different from state control, because all the problems that we have seen so far, and we will be seeing as we move forward, is still the lack of will to separate state control from education. And of course, the caveat is that we need reasonable restrictions, but the excessive regulations that the state has on education has to gradually give way for progressive privates to also do well as we move forward. So that's the essence of Dr. Radhakrishnan Commission's report insofar as the role of private education institutions in higher education are concerned. Until the late 1970s or 80s, we did not see much of traffic amongst private players in higher education. It is only two states, I think Karnataka and Maharashtra, took a lead. And that's when in 1983, the state of Tamil Nadu, under the visionary leadership of Dr. NGR, found the flight of intellectual capital from Tamil Nadu to these two states. And then was born the concept of self-financing engineering colleges in 1984. And from then on, the way in which Tamil Nadu has responded to the concept of self-financing colleges was phenomenal, that we saw a lot of good institutions coming up between 1984 and I would say up to 2000. And after that, we saw a mushrooming of engineering colleges all over the country. And that was a result of very bad policy making, about which I will talk a little later, that created in this polarized growth of engineering education concentrated within 4 or 5 states. But the role of private institutions in professional education from 1980 onwards saw the participation of a very large student community, which otherwise would have been deprived of professional education. And we should be mindful of the fact that this growth has resulted in a vast number of students from very challenged background to earn a professional degree. And that's one of the reasons that has contributed to the economic growth of our country. So that's the history of the growth of private education institutions, not only in terms of creating higher gross enrollment ratio as the government would like to measure it and record it, but also churning economic wealth year on year and moving the country as a whole in the realms of the economic ecosystem that we see in the world today. So undoubtedly, in addition to the state-funded institutions, central and state government, 75 to 80% of higher education being delivered by private education institutions, the role of such institutions has been significant and very phenomenal, and nobody can discard the positive contribution that these institutions have made. And of course, just as there are bad government institutions, there are also bad private institutions. It is a part of the ecosystem that we will have to live with. And as we move forward, we will share with the audience here as to how frequently the role of the policymakers, the role of the legislature, the role of the court has also shaped the contours of higher education in our country. Amrit.
Moving on, the 50s also had 2 other important developments. One was, of course, in the end of the 50s, we had the judgment of the Supreme Court in the Re-Kerala Education Bill, which was one of the oldest judgments on the question of private unaided minority institutions, private unaided non-minority institutions. It touched upon the subject of university administration. And for the first time, the question of autonomy over admission, over day-to-day management, all of that, the beginnings were discussed in the Re-Kerala Education Bill. And as we move on, the other important development comes in the 60s, when the Supreme Court decided the Aziz Basha case, where a constitution bench of the Supreme Court heard the matter relating to one of the renowned minority institutions in the country, and the definition of a university, of how a university was established, the theory of incorporation for the first time by state law, by state legislation. There was a lot of debate about this judgment, and the Aziz Basha case laid down the parameters within which private initiative for the first time was expressly and explicitly recognized by the apex court, when it said in the judgment that private educational initiatives come within the fold of 29 and 30, which is a part of part 3, that is fundamental rights, and the state has to accept it in the way the country was progressing. After the Aziz Basha case, of course, we do come into the 70s. The 70s saw a huge development of fundamental rights jurisprudence, and I'm not going into that in detail because all of that has to be seen in the larger context of the nation, constitutional jurisprudence which was being developed. And we have the all-important judgment in 1974 of Ahmedabad St. Xavier's Education Society, where the petitioners in that matter were represented by none other than Nani Palkhiwala, whose centenary we are celebrating this year. And to talk about that judgment, which is probably one of the most erudite scholarly judgments of the Indian Supreme Court in its constitutional history itself, dealt with 5 impugned sections of the then extant Gujarat law, which impinged, which allegedly impinged on the rights of the minority institutions there to run the universities. And of course, we know the outcome of what was seen at that point of time, the right to admission, the staff selection, all of that was discussed in 74. And moving on to the late 70s, the government had the advantage of the Kothari Commission report, which came in the late 60s, which again was an overall report on the entire contours of education in India itself. The terms of reference were very large, and there has been a lot of literature about it. But this was a time when, for the very first occasion, the rights of private, unaided, non-minority institutions, private, unaided minority institutions overlapped. The Constitution does not deal with the idea of private universities as such, but recognizes the scope for it under Article 19(1)(g) itself. The fundamental right to occupation itself recognizes this need for investment in education, and private institutions are a part of it. So we reach the end of the 70s with this, and we now approach a very eventful decade, that is the 80s. And to give the context of it, I'm sure that you'll be able to give us a better insight as to how the seeds of deemed universities were sown and how the UGC Act was being interpreted at this point of time. Over to you.
Yeah, so thank you, Amrit. You have touched upon certain landmark judgments. And I must confess that, I am not going to be as rich in diction in the legal terms as Amrit was, but more as somebody who has been at the receiving end, engaging with the committee of lawyers. I also borrow some of the language that you use. Now, as Amrit rightly said, the way in which the role of the courts characterized the evolution of higher education, and more particularly private education, and then more particularly the rights of minority institutions as well, traces back from 1958, where he rightly talked about the Kerala Education Act. And in terms of the word university itself, again, as he pointed out in the Aziz Basha case, 1968, a constitution bench that was dealing with the Aligarh Muslim University Act. And later, 1974, the very famous St. Xavier's College case. And that's where the test that the legendary Justice S.K. Khanna wanted to administer to test the absoluteness of Article 31. And in the interim time between 1958 and 74, 1958, 68 and 74, I would also like to recall one of the finest speeches that Justice Gajendra Gadkar in 1972, when he was delivering the Jawaharlal Nehru Memorial Lecture in the Institute of Parliamentary Studies, where he talked about nationalism in education. And there he spent a lot of time on the absoluteness in Article 31 insofar as the rights of minority institutions are concerned. And this was referred, not the speech, but the reference to this character of a speech was referred very recently in the West Bengal Madrasa Commission Act, order of the Supreme Court, January 2020, where it again, TMA Pi Foundation case, about which Amrit will be talking later. In that case, that formed the sheet anchor. Justice Gajendra Gadkar in that speech in 1972 was very categorical on one thing, that he said that when minority institutions are offering generic education with the teachers and students predominantly from the cosmopolitan and have no connection whatever with the protection of the language, culture or script of the minorities concerned, then we should ask the question whether such secular collegiate institute education, just like an arts college or a physics or a chemistry, that institutions, whether the benefit of the absolute right conferred on religious and linguistic minorities by 29, 30 in general and 31 can be given to such generic institutions. that seeded the thought after Justice Gajendra Khatkar's speech. Justice S.K. Khanna in that St. Xavier's case refers this test which needs to be administered, which later got tested in the recent Supreme Court 2020 judgment on the West Bengal Madrasa Commission Act. Now, having said that, the concept of universities was actually a part of Radhakrishnan's Commission's report, where he did not generalize the word university. He also carefully used the word deemed universities also, because he meant chartered universities to be deemed universities, where he said there will be institutions and colleges that are doing work just like other universities that are created by central or state legislature, but they are falling short to the extent that they don't have the power to confer the degrees, because they are not universities per se, but the work that they are doing are of university standards. So the commission report recommended that such institutions need to be encouraged and must be labeled as charter universities, as was the practice in UK in those times, and came the concept of deemed universities. And it was this reference by Dr. Radhakrishnan that got reflected in the UGC Act of 1956, where under Section 3, by an executive charter, by notification by the MHRD, institutions that do work comparable to the standards of state and central universities were declared as deemed universities. But what happened later is the way in which things transformed, both in the positive sense as well as in the negative sense, created a lot of confusion amongst the deemed universities, and that is going to be the crux of the discussion that we are going to have today. But all of the events that have happened in the past concerning higher education, there has always been a conflict of thought, a conflict of legal minds, conflict of procedures, conflict in guidelines, conflict in regulations, as to what extent freedom can be enjoyed by private institutions. And two important Supreme Court orders that characterized the post-1990 growth in higher education, beginning with Unnikrishnan in 1993, followed by TMA Pai in 2001 that overruled Unnikrishnan. This was the very critical period that saw different phases of private higher education institutions. Now, on this, I would like Amrit to just give a background to these two landmark cases before we expound on it further.
Before that, sir, we should also remember that in the 80s, there was another judgment of the Supreme Court in Premchand Jain versus R.K. Chabra, which dealt with Section 23 of the UGC Act. And we would remember Section 23 of the UGC Act as enforcing a sort of prohibition on what X can do or Y cannot do. And in fact, the Supreme Court said it is for the central government next to consider whether an institution covered under Section 3 of the Act, which is the deemed university, would not satisfy the provisions of Section 23 of the Act. And if in the opinion of the central government, such an institution is not covered, whether an appropriate amendment to 23 itself should be made. Here, the ball again went to the central government's court, and we moved on to the 90s.
Yeah.
And in the 90s, we have a watershed moment in the history of Indian higher education, which is the Unnikrishnan judgment. The 90s were a time when there was a lot in the media about capitation fee, about profiteering as it was termed as, and private universities were under the scanner. And ultimately, the Unnikrishnan judgment, although it conceded in para 85 of that judgment that investment
Private institutions
was inevitable, it did say that there has to be government control, and there was an element of capitulating rather, or accepting the socialist vision, which was also discussed about till around this judgment. And we must also recall at this time that initially education was entry 11 of the state list. But after the 1976 amendment, the 42nd amendment, it became entry 25 of the concurrent list. This shifted the metrics of the discourse in a sense that both the union and the state were now constitutional stakeholders, and this has to be the order of the day as we move down. While reaching the dawn of the millennium, of course, there was a sort of legal encounter between the regulatory bigwigs, the Universities Grants Commission, the All India Council for Technical Education, AICTE, and of course the deemed universities in the seminal Bharathidasan University judgment. And what was the situation? This was the first deemed universities case. And the situation that we are talking about is the norms for admission, or the regulations, the notifications as they stood, the counseling process, and what kind of courses that the private deemed universities could start without the permission of the AICTE, without the permission of the AICTE or not. And this was, in fact, the case went from Tamil Nadu, and ultimately the Supreme Court said that if it was already a professional courses imparting institution, a technical institution with background in these subjects, they need not seek AICTE approval. Then it became a deemed university. So what is this span, the millennial scenario on deemed university?
Okay, now before I go to that Bharathidasan University case, and that will lead to the Orissa lift irrigation, which changed completely the terminological contours, the terminological reference to deemed university as a concept. You made a reference to a case that I failed to notice, but now I recollect, the 1984 Supreme Court, the Premchand Jain versus Chabria case. The issue, as you rightly pointed out, was whether the section 23 of the UGC Act should be amended to explicitly exclude deemed universities from using the word university. And that discretion was vested with the government itself, and the court said it did not want to undertake that exercise, but left it to the wisdom of the government to see whether such an amendment was necessary. Now, that was a 3-judge bench of the Supreme Court that delivered this judgment. And pursuant to that, nothing was done by the government, but was only during 2005-06. In fact, I was personally also involved in that meeting when the then HRD minister was raising this issue. I pointed this out to the HRD minister in the annual conference of deemed universities, that in 1984 that the Supreme Court has made such order, and the government has to actually take a final decision on this. And then the government constituted a committee that comprised the Secretary of Higher Education, Chairman of UGC and AICTE. The committee recommended that no amendment to section 23 was necessary, and that deemed universities can use the word university. And based on that committee recommendation in September 2006, the UGC issued a notification saying that deemed universities can use the word university. And this was a statement that went on record in the parliament also, when the state HRD minister in December 2006 recalled this and said deemed universities can use the word university. And the genesis there also, the Aziz Basha case that you are mentioning in 1968, that was also partially referred, though not explicitly, in the 1984 Supreme Court. But then by the theory of interpretation, the word established was given a new meaning, saying that established also means creation. So deemed universities are creation of a central act, and in this case the UGC Act, and hence are established by a central act in that sense that it was created through an executive order, not by a state legislature or a central legislature. So all was working fine, that deemed universities were allowed to use the word universities because the Supreme Court gave them the pathway for that. The government appointed committee recommended that and notified in 2006, and that's when we started using the word deemed universities. Now the way in which this all changed, it was because of the Orissa lift irrigation matter. Now before we go there, you had pointed the Unni Krishnan judgment in 1993, as well as the TMA Pai and later the Bharathidasan University. While Bharathidasan University case is slightly different from TMA Pai and Unni Krishnan, but in Unni Krishnan, the role of private higher education institutions, as you rightly mentioned, was recorded. And it said that yes, private institutions were necessary. But what the TMA Pai Foundation case considered was the scheme that the court laid in terms of how admission needs to be done, what should be the prescribed fee structure, and all of this was, in a sense, excessive control on unaided educational institutions, which the TMA Pai Foundation overruled and found that if you look at para 50 of the TMA Pai Foundation case, it clearly says unaided education institutions have the autonomy in terms of student admission, fixing the fees, selecting the faculty, having their own governing body and all of that. So as long as it doesn't get aid, it can enjoy this autonomy. But that doesn't mean that they have the right to maladminister. The right to administer doesn't include right to maladminister, was the crux of TMA Pai Foundation case. And it said the government had rights to prescribe norms and standards. And it is for the private institutions to make sure that they comply with the norms and standards. So that was the essence of the TMA Pai Foundation case. But what also happened later, the TMA Pai Foundation case was a 11-judge bench, a very historic judgment. Later, in the name of clarification, interpretation, and all of that, in 2003 in Islamic, which was a 5-judge bench, and then in 2007 Inamdar was a 7-judge bench. A 11-judge bench, in fact, the legendary Sri K. Parasaran used to say that Unni Krishnan case, shifted the pendulum to one extreme. TMA Pai Foundation case shifted the pendulum to the other extreme. And he very rightly said, it will take some more years for the pendulum to come to its final position of rest. Then that seemed to have happened in the 2020 West Bengal Madrasa Commission Act, where all the references, the TMA Pai Foundation case was the sheet anchor. But again, the Islamic and Inamdar, by virtue of 5 plus 7, arithmetically was 12. But that doesn't mean that the 11-judge bench of TMA Pai was no longer valid. Still, it holds the field, because that was the sheet anchor that gave the rights to private unaided education institutions, both minority and non-minority. But what happened, that I'm sure you will lead the discussion to this case, the Orissa lift irrigation case, is the way in which some of the deemed universities started using the powers vested on them. And I'm using the word with great caution, using the powers. Actually, it was misusing some of the responsibilities that the deemed universities were vested with. A few of them would have done that. But the way in which the Supreme Court dealt this issue, and consequentially the way in which AICT and UGC started issuing guidelines, regulations, and policies was a little bit surprising to us. And I will pause here so that you lay down the background for the Orissa lift irrigation, and then I will explain what actually happened and what was the consequential effect of this on deemed universities.
Once again, shifting timelines, getting back to 2000-2001, after the Bharatidasan judgment was there.
Oh, I forgot to talk about that. I said it was in a different thing. Okay, since you raised that, see, Bharatidasan University case in 2002 was the issue of whether a university needs to get approval from AICTE to start engineering programs. And rightly, the Supreme Court in 2002 held that universities need not get approval from AICTE to start programs in engineering, MBA or MCA, or programs that were under the control of AICTE, because UGC empowers the universities by section 22 to award any degrees. And since AICTE is also a statutory act and UGC is also a statutory act, one statutory act cannot infringe into the powers of the other statutory act, and hence the Supreme Court felt that universities need not seek prior approval from AICTE to start engineering degree programs. And in my view, that was a right order. But how that got changed in the latest Orissa lift irrigation is something that we will discuss as we move forward.
Again, shifting timelines, after 2001, we come to a very important date, which in my humble opinion is in India's constitutional history, is 31st October 2002, when the TMA Pai judgment was delivered. It was a bench of 11 learned judges, 11 seminal legal issues, all of them reduced into 5 main legal issues, which the judges dealt with, and there was a lead opinion of the then Chief Justice of India. There were separate and concurring opinions and a partly dissentient view by Justice Ruma Pal. The 5 main issues, the first one relates to whether there is a fundamental right to establish educational institutions at all in the Constitution, whether Unnikrishnan's case requires reconsideration, what is the degree of interference in the day-to-day affairs of private, unaided, non-minority, minority institutions? What are the parameters within which provincial or linguistic or religious minorities are identified in every state? This was another issue. And the last issue was about the private, aided, unaided minority institutions as a separate category. The Supreme Court, in a 700-page judgment, went into this at great length, and as you rightly pointed out, in para 55, which I believe is the nerve center of the entire debate about deemed universities, it is very clear that in the case of private unaided institutions, I quote, maximum autonomy in day-to-day administration has to be with the private unaided institutions. Bureaucratic or governmental interference in the administration of such an institution will undermine its independence. These are the words of the Supreme Court and of the 11 judges bench, which is surely the cornerstone of the whole debate. And then we come to 2003 in the Islamic Academy case, where the Supreme Court starts the judgment by saying that, yes, there is 11 judges bench judgment, and that has been seen from different perspectives. And that is the judgment, the Islamic Academy judgment, where this overlapping domain of private unaided minority institutions and private unaided minority, non-minority institutions was analyzed. And in fact, the Supreme Court goes to the extent of saying only when there is a scenario where there is government nationalization of higher education will this principle in the 11 judges bench judgment of TMA Pai ever be whittled down. And that was the significance attached to it. And then, of course, the PA Inamdar judgment, where there was a lot about the scheme to the judgment, to the earlier TMA Pai judgment was analyzed. And the fundamental rights jurisprudence was only enhanced by the PA Inamdar judgment. Then, as we go by, as you rightly pointed out, the 2006 circular was there, which in many ways, for supporters of private enterprise in the 21st century, the apartheid which was there between government institutions and private institutions was ended. And this inaugurated a new era of cooperation between different countries in higher education, because there is still a perception that when it's a deemed to be university is somewhat different from government universities by some foreign universities there. They feel there is some difference, and I would also want your take on that. And of course, then we come to 2006, where there was a tripartite litigation between UGC, AICTE and the deemed universities in the Madras High Court. Of course, that judgment only declared as valid certain impugned sections of the UGC Act and said that yes, if the UGC and the AICTE decide inspection, which is physical inspection, has to be done. And then we come to the end of the decade, 2009, which I'm sure you will deal with the Tandon Committee, the regulatory subtext and the regulatory supertext of what the committee's recommendations were, table 1, table 2, table 3, which succeeded the decade's developments.
Yeah, okay. So you've given me a question paper, I would say. So I just made a note of it. But two things in the TMA Pai case, that education, starting an education institution is a fundamental right, was clearly established. And as long as, and if you're a private education institution, you have the reasonable freedom to administer the institution when it comes to admitting or fee fixation or appointment of faculty. And secondly, the rights of minority, aided, unaided, non-minority, aided, unaided was also clearly highlighted in that case, and then later clarified in different ways in Islamic and Inamdar. But still, the TMA Pai, in my view, holds the validity of the scheme of things under which various regulations and guidelines are framed by the policy makers. And the third important thing in the TMA Pai case was that it clearly overruled the Unnikrishnan scheme of admission, saying that it was actually not constitutional. Now, you also talked about the tripartite litigation in 2006, where pursuant to the Bharathidasan University case, where universities, including deemed universities, need not seek prior approval from AICTE, there was a misleading, or rather a notification that could have been worded better in the form of an advertisement, not a notification, an advertisement that AICTE had issued that led to this litigation. Deemed universities thought that they had to seek approval of AICTE, and then the Madras High Court first bench felt that it was not perfectly aligned with the Supreme Court's order in the Bharathidasan University case, but went on to add that, however, deemed universities are bound to follow the norms and standards prescribed by AICTE, though they did not seek prior approval. In fact, we took that stand as a deemed university. Shastra stood out in that cluster to say that we don't have a problem if an inspection jointly by UGC and AICTE is conducted to check whether norms and standards are being maintained. So that was the stand that we also took before the High Court of Madras. And that was upheld to the extent that no approval is necessary from AICTE, but deemed universities should maintain the norms and standards. After which came this 2009 issue of Tandon Committee. Here I will spend maybe 2 to 3 minutes, or maybe a little more than that. We have 10 more minutes. So we will reserve the last 10 minutes for the Odisha lift irrigation case. The Tandon Committee was actually pursuant to a kind of a sting operation that was conducted, and that occupied a lot of media space on a few institutions, the questionable admission policies that they were making. So basically it was, institutions trying to capitate students during the admission times, as a result of which the MHRD issued a notification that appointed a committee comprising Professor P.N. Tandon as the chairman and other academics as members of the committee to review all the deemed universities in the country. And the way in which the entire review exercise was happening. In fact, the moment that committee was constituted, notified, and the process started, many were in fact apprehensive whether the MHRD had powers to even do that, because the UGC Act, the UGC is empowered to do that, and there were certain procedural formalities that had to be complied. But of course, the Tandon Committee became an extra regulatory authority by itself and started collecting data. And we submitted data, and over a 15-minute presentation that was made in Delhi, universities were classified as category A, B, and C. And then when this was challenged before the Supreme Court, the way in which the Tandon Committee conducted this review mechanism, this was all discussed at threadbare. And finally, the court also was of the view that the entire exercise that the Tandon Committee did actually was not correct, and it declared it to be a procedure that was incorrect. And then Tandon Committee entire report was not accepted by the Supreme Court, and it finally said it was UGC or NAC or other statutory or autonomous review mechanisms that can review performance of deemed universities. So that's how the Tandon Committee report came to rest, that it was found to be very faulty in its methodology. The way in which the entire review was conducted was questionable, and the issues framed also was not very tightly packed. It was very loosely packed, and finally the issue came to an end, and the Supreme Court held that the Tandon Committee recommendations did not have any value at all. But the issue of the deemed universities did not rest after that. Regulations came from UGC. That was also challenged before different high courts in different states.
The 2010 judgments.
Yeah, the 2010 regulations. So that was again directly against the TMA PI. See, unfortunately, what is happening today is that in the name of rules and regulations. Regulations and guidelines which are subordinate legislation seem to assume new powers that even the statutory bodies themselves don't give these agencies that power. So regulations came out just left, right and center, giving new restrictions, and the 2010 deemed university regulation was challenged in the Madras High Court. It was stayed, the single judge, the regulation was upheld, but then it was stayed in the bench. But then before that, before the issue came to a finality, a new set of regulations came, and it did not address the issue on which the 2010 regulations was stayed. So leaving that, it added more dimensions, and then a lot of such regulations kept on coming. But still, the issue of deemed universities, in my opinion, needs to be addressed in a more graded manner, in a more positive manner. And I'm sure the way in which I see things happening, there should be in the new education policy that we are eagerly waiting. There should be a special provisions that can enable the positive and progressive pathway for deemed universities to grow further. And though you have not raised it, I'm sure you will raise it. The Orissa lift irrigation, and people also talk a lot about these institutes of eminence, the IUE. I have my own opinion on that as well. So I will stop here. The Tandon committee was actually, since you raised that, today the value of Tandon committee or the recommendations of the Tandon committee report has no value, is my opinion.
The adverting back to the 2010 regulations, I'm sure that the kind of the atomic explosion impact that the regulations had, where the government was supposed to have a say in the administration of the educational institutions, there was somebody nominated by the government on the boards as a chancellor. I'm sure it couldn't have been countenanced, and rightly so, the regulations have not come to stay. But now moving on, we reach a very eventful decade again from 2010 onwards, and it all culminates in 2017 in an interesting judgment of the Supreme Court in Orissa Lift Irrigation Corporation versus Ravi Shankar Patro, which came in the end of 2017. Surprisingly, it was a service matter where an employee was denied promotion. Several rounds of litigation were over in 2009 only on the parameters of service law alone. And later, when the matter reached a head in the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court went into a whole host of issues, right from who can use the tag of deemed universities. It was about, in fact, distance education. The aggrieved party before the Orissa High Court actually had gained his engineering degree from a distance education forum. And that came under the scanner. And ultimately, the Supreme Court, in the last paras, drags almost all the universities into the scope of the judgment. And it is interesting to note that they have said that the deemed to be university should be the tag which is used by deemed university as part of the nomenclature, and universities shall not be used as the suffixing name to the universities which became private or were privatized or are deemed universities as such. So the Ravi Shankar Patro decision was in fact a different lane in the history of deemed universities, and this was followed by a government circular which was to be complied by all private universities as such.
Yeah.
So Ravi Shankar Patro throws a whole range of possibilities.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that you have your opinion on this.
See, the Orissa lift irrigation, there were two effects of the Supreme Court order on that. One, that deemed universities had to get the approval of AICTE for its engineering programs, and two, the use of the word university itself by deemed universities. Now, these two had far-reaching impacts on deemed universities. So, on the first thing, on the use of the word university, now we already traced how it was by permission, by notification of the UGC after a committee constituted by MHRD pursuant to a 1984 three-judge Supreme Court order. The deemed universities were allowed to use the word university. In fact, in an attempt to bring clarity to the issue, some deemed universities, including Shastra and an association of deemed universities, approached the Supreme Court after the Orissa lift. But of course, we are seeking modification. and various impleading applications on various grounds. But what I thought could have happened but did not happen was, the interpreter of the law allows the interpreter to inquire into the subjective intent of the author, and rather the intent the author would have had he or she acted reasonably. Now, the spirit of the purposive construction, which the Supreme Court has highlighted in many cases, in my view, was missing for the simple reason that, as you rightly said, the issue was on distance education engineering degrees offered by deemed universities who did not offer engineering programs before they became deemed university. Now, that was the issue. So that classification, the interpretation in the classification of the degrees was completely missing. The 4 universities that were before the Supreme Court were the ones who offered engineering degrees after they became a deemed university, and that too in the distance mode, when AICT itself, as a statutory body responsible for engineering education, did not have any guidelines whatsoever on distance education engineering degrees. They started offering distance education engineering degrees, and that was rightly struck to be invalid. And the second one, the issue was not before the court at all, whether the deemed universities can use the word university or not. In fact, you can recall in 1990, in the Unnikrishnan case, I think Justice Bharucha, when different issues were raised, he clearly said that issues that were not before the court will not be handled by the court. Even in the Tandon Committee case, when the petitioner said deemed university should not use the word university, the Supreme Court did not entertain that argument of the petitioner. It simply said that the petitioner can move to the appropriate forum for seeking relief, whether for seeking such relief or that deemed universities cannot use the word university. So Supreme Court did not entertain. Whereas in this case, this issue was not before the court, and 128 deemed universities were not before the court. It was only the 4 deemed universities. So in our modification petition also we argued this, that the principles of causa omissus, which the Supreme Court again has highlighted in various cases, and as an audience that is as enlightened as this, GP Singh's interpretation of statutes, is where the general principle is that that a matter which should have been but has not been provided for in a statute cannot be supplied by the courts, because if the courts supply that, then they would be legislating and not constructing the interpretation of that. So that was not really appreciated, and our modification petition was also not accepted, and our attempts went in vain. And today deemed universities cannot use the word university. Now is the right time. If you ask me what is the solution, I think the UGC Act has to be amended. Originally, the Supreme Court gave the discretion to the government, and the government felt that the UGC Act need not be amended. Now, pursuant to the Orissa lift irrigation matter, the only solution is, and I've been repeatedly also writing on this, making representations, that the UGC Act has to be amended to the extent that deemed universities can use the word university, because in foreign countries, people ask, you're a deemed university, when will you become a university? These are things that are making us feel so embarrassed that though we are empowered to award degrees under Section 22, we are not able to use the word university under Section 23. But the very nature of university, one of the fundamental rights of the university is to award degrees. So Section 22, you can award degrees. Section 23 of the UGC Act, you cannot use the word university, something that needs to be fixed by way of amendment of the UGC Act. So the Orissa lift irrigation case definitely is, in fact, it's a 2-judge bench. The bench was not, the bench was not informed, or rather, it was not brought. The parties before the Supreme Court did not highlight the 1984 Supreme Court order, nor the Bharatdasan University case very forcefully, because the issue was on distance education. It was not whether deemed universities can use the word university or not. So in terms of principles of natural justice, the remaining 124 deemed universities were never heard on this issue at all. And by unfortunate circumstances, we are now not allowed to use the word university. And hopefully if the UGC Act is amended, then deemed universities can use the word university. And that is with that little hope that I still feel that UGC Act will be amended, and I hope the Act gets amended and deemed universities can use the word university.
The last part of the discussion is centered on the recent development in 2017 about the need for recognizing certain institutions as institutions of eminence. And this development, the IOE paradigm is come to be known as. So how does the regulator look at it? Is it eminently regulatory, or is it educationally eminent, or how are these institutions categorized?
Okay, see, so this shall be the last part of this, and then we will open the floor for questions. When the issue of IOE came, I wrote a very incisive piece for the New Indian Express, and I said, looking at the guidelines, it appears to me that it is the survival of the fattest and not survival of the fittest, because that time when the preliminary guidelines were framed, it said the net worth of the promoters of institutions, private institutions, must be 8,000 crores. And I was of the opinion, if I have 8,000 crores with me, by now I would have built a world-class university myself. Why do I need an IOE status for that? Then it was reduced to 5,000 crores, which itself is a very tall order for private institutions, net worth of promoters being 5,000 crores for a greenfield and 3,000 crores for existing institutions. But somehow that never got changed, and the new regulations was announced. But the spirit of the regulation, I am not questioning that, because we need institutions to be given more freedom so that we become world-class universities. But I've written about world-class universities in a number of my articles. Everybody wants to become a world-class university. Philip Albach is a specialist in world-class universities of the Babson College. He used to say that, everybody wants to become a world-class university. Nobody knows what it is, and no one knows how to become one. So world-class university is kind of a very abstract concept that everybody wants to be. But if you look at the records, in the 19th century, it took $50 million and 200 years to build a world-class university. In fact, University of Chicago wanted to build with $100 million in 20 years in the late 19th century. Then 20th century, the Cornell University set its world-class medical college in Qatar for $750 million. And in 2012 to 15, the 21st century, the King Abdullah University, they invested $3 billion to build a world-class university that is independent of state support, state interference. So that is the extent of investment that is required to build a world-class university. The IOE effort was to identify 10 government institutions, and each of them will be given 1,000 crores over a period of 5 years. And with this, they need to become world-class universities, figure in the top 500 rankings. This is nothing when you consider the investment that is required to become a world-class university. And 10 private institutions who will not be given money, but who will not be given grant, but who will be given enough academic freedom to become world-class university. There again, this is not enough from the simple sense that for a country like ours, when the National Knowledge Commission in 2006-07 said we need 1,500 new universities, that's the size that we are handling. We don't need just 20 IOEs. In spirit, it is good, but in absolute numbers, we need 100 IOEs. If you give 100 IOE status to progressive universities, at least 10 can meet the high standards that the government wants these institutions to build. And second important thing is, in the name of academic freedom that is given to IOEs, it is not unfettered freedom. It is not that IOEs can be doing anything that they want to do. It is not that IOEs can start offering all sorts of degree programs without the approval of statutory bodies. See, IOE is after all a regulation. And regulation is, as you all know, it's a subordinate legislation. The Act has the supreme power. So what the Act does not foresee, the regulations cannot grant such powers. So within a very restrictive framework, the IOEs are given certain freedom on 6 academic affairs. It doesn't mean that they enjoy complete freedom. But what I envisage, if this can be given to 20, I would want this to be given to 100 institutions, because that's the size of the problem that we are facing. And if you have a problem of this big size, you need a solution of a bigger size. And the solution is you give 100 IUE status. Because in private institutions, you are not giving any grant for private institutions. So it is not going to burden the state exchequer. So it's a recognition to private institutions. So moving forward, I think the government will be opening up, or it should open up to accept these new ideas in our effort to build a world-class university, not knowing what actually it is. So basically, we need to be
concluding the dialogue. We have touched upon this rather contentious and litigious journey that deemed universities have had, and on both the realms of law and public policy, deemed universities have come a long way, and the order of deemed universities is here to stay because of the imminent demand in a country like India and the globe across. Most of the universities that have become global world-class universities in the United States, Western Europe are all private universities, which means that private initiative should always be encouraged. And looking at the stakeholder regulator gap, which we see in a country like India, it's always an existential question. Whether it's Orissa lift irrigation or Bharatidasan, it was an existential question for deemed universities. And it's been a zero-sum game, because the fact that we have subordinate legislation in this country, where we must understand that subordinate legislation is subordinate to the Parent Act, and the draftsman will have to be attuned to the moving reality that subordinate legislation cannot change or determine the nature of private deemed universities. And ultimately, we are at a stage post the millennium and during this COVID crisis especially, which I'm sure will be a different subject which you have been addressing on the online education during COVID times, COVIDian challenges. Like Andre Bette, who was one of India's most eminent sociologists, said, the universities in India are at crossroads. From here on, it's the direction of growth, progress, and hope that we will move on. And it's been a wonderful dialogue on these questions, and I'm very thankful to the organizers for this and Dr. Vaidya for this.
Yeah, we are ready to take questions. So Mr. Jaykumar can facilitate the Q&A session.
Thank you very much, sir. I'll unmute JK, sir. And I see the first question from N. Venkatraman, sir himself. So, JK, sir, I'll unmute NV, sir.
Yeah, first let me welcome them.
Sure.
In fact, thank you, sir. Before getting into opening the floor, let me welcome three great seniors we are having on as in the gallery. We are having the Additional Solicitor General N. Venkatraman. We're also having our in-house Senior Advocate Pushya Sitaraman, as well as we are also having Hema Sampath, Senior Advocate. Our hearty welcome to all the seniors. And with this, I'll go to the floor. Before I open the session to Senior NV, sir, you both, in fact, this is a completely new subject for us, but you made it so familiar that I'm sure that the other questions which are going to come are completely educated only by this lecture. Within a short span of 40 minutes, if you're able to educate this crowd, including me, I'm saying, it was a fabulous session, I have to say. In fact, I'm really wondering whether it is a wordplay to call it as, you're a vice chancellor or a vice chancellor. I don't know whether it's a wordplay, but it suits very well. Thank you, sir. Such a wonderful, and Amrit, you were flowing like Niagara, I have to say that. It was a flow, it was a fantastic flow of diction, content, and beautiful presentation. Thank you, both the speakers. Now I open the floor to the session, and rightly I will start with Senior N. Venkatraman. Sir, over to you.
Thank you, JK and Prithvi. Dr. Vaidya sir, thanks a lot, and hey, Amrit, thanks. It was like watching a nice interview in a foreign channel. You gave us that experience. Amrit, rombo nanna pesna, rombo nanna organize pannichu. I mean, you should have worked a lot before coming over here to present it, and you have taken this session very seriously. So we are grateful to both you and to sir. And thank you, Vaidya sir. I have one question. I'll take the last bit of what you spoke and see we can develop that into a discussion. When India is resourceful in many aspects, especially knowledge. In fact, our people go, get educated in US and settle in US and add value there. Why has the reverse engineering not happened so far? Is it because of regulatory constraints or not planning? And how quickly do you visualize a change, especially in a post-COVID situation? And can India become a superpower in education? In your dream or in your vision? This is my question.
To me or Amrita? Who?
No, I'm asking Dr. Vaidya.
Oh, okay. Fine. See, actually, this is becoming a superpower in education is still a very distant goal, because all said and done, the framework within which we operate is still very restrictive. So if we are able to remove the strangulatory regulations and institutions are oxygenated enough, and if we are oxygenated enough by way of various policy reforms, we definitely have the wherewithal and resources to become a knowledge superpower. And there are signs and signals coming in that direction, and it's a matter of time. But it's a matter of long time. It is not going to happen overnight. Since you said post-COVIDian, we cannot say, next year onwards, people will not go to other places, or they will stay back here for higher education, graduate and PhD. In fact, the resources that is required to build institutions of that type, the Caltech or Stanfords of the world, is huge. And if you look at our budgetary allocation for education, is hardly anything. And the role of various other stakeholders in building India as an educational superpower is also equally important, because inconveniently higher education institutions are sandwiched between a failed schooling and an excessively aspirational industry. So the industry says, you prepare your graduates the way in which we want, and the school fails to do certain basic things. So by the time we undo certain things that the student comes with after schooling and then start preparing them for graduation, hardly 3-4 years is not enough at all. And then they are ready in the job market. So the challenge that institutions face is so huge. And becoming a knowledge superpower is something different, where it requires a lot of research, basic research, applied research, and that's where the role of industry has to be significantly high. The academic and the industry collaboration is very weak. It needs to be strengthened. Industry has to come forward. It has to support research. It has to create labs. It has to create facilities. And only then we can become knowledge superpower. If you look at how Stanford or Caltech or MITs have done, it's because of industry research. Much of the product discoveries, process discoveries comes from the university labs. If you look back, hardly any such activity, barring a few exceptions, come from institutions that are homegrown. But many of the Indians going abroad have come with far-reaching discoveries, and that's because of the supportive ecosystem that is available there. If that ecosystem is available, no doubt we can become a knowledge superpower, because this is not something new to us, because we have been a knowledge superpower in the past. So it is only that Indian universities are waiting for the magic formula to strike back. The earlier we strike back, the better it is for the nation.
Thank you so much for this answer, sir. And once again, what JK said in the beginning, Shastra has contributed both intelligence and character amongst its students. He said that as a part of his introduction, and I vouch that as a parent. Thank you. Thank you, Amrit.
Thank you, sir. Sir, my first question to you. Education has always been a very privileged policy of India. In fact, I'm told that that was the first commission. First commission was an education commission under Dr. Radhakrishnan in the independent India. So this question goes to Amrit. Amrit, if we are going to chronicle from 1948, as you see from section 3, educated by you, section 3, the deemed universities at that point of time, to me seems to be an exception, not a norm. It was only to acknowledge the pre-independence extraordinary institutions from the, even the text, it goes like that, to recognize them, to acknowledge them at par with the universities. And also, it was also, some norms were cast in that. And it could also be, if we chronicle over years, over decades, first 3 decades, didn't see much of deemed universities in place. We had very handful, I believe. And it was only after post 1980, there was a sprout, and it came, a mushroom of deemed universities came into place. This is what is my understanding. That be so. My question to you would be number one. Of course, rightly, doctor said there is a gap, very wide gap. That there is he said some 1,500 universities is the requirement, or something. It was from some, a committee report. But in 2009, there was an explosion. Till then, we were not seeing it so deep. And 2009, when the Yashpal and Tandon committee reports came up, and there was a complete, everywhere it was the news, as I said, as doctor said, media space was completely filled with deemed universities and various. In fact, Yashpal committee went on to say that we have to suspend deemed universities till Tandon committee report comes because of various considerable misuse. That's what I believe the word used. Considerable misuse of the provisions, that was what it was stated. So it painted all black. From then, there is, so now the doctor said Tandon committee has no value right now. But from there, I also want you to tell me that there is a conflict between, always there is a conflict between an autonomy and an accountability. They are always always fighting. That being the case, should when that is be a very education being that to higher education be a very privileged sector, enjoying enormous concessions and IT benefits, etc. Even GST you don't have. So, sir?
We do pay GST.
No GST on the tuition fee, but otherwise higher education GST is applicable.
No, on education, I think when there is a law which is conferred, when a law is given, there is an exemption for that. When conferred a degree is given, there is no GST on that. That is what is my belief. Anyway, we'll come to that. What I'm saying is, it's not about exactly pin drop to GST. I'm saying that when tax concessions are there, should it not be policed? Should it not be regulated? I'm not going into the extent of Tandon committee's recommendations. I'm saying that should it not be policed? Should we need a regulation, a good framed regulation? What is your take on that? And adding one point to it, that from the other decisions what you quoted, Orissa lift irrigation, etc., as pointed out by Mr. C.K. Chandrasekhar in the chat also, the general feeling is all is not well. I'm not saying that everyone is bad, but there are also black sheep in that. That is what Mr. C.K. Chandrasekhar is saying. And coupled with that, don't you feel that there should be a tightrope or at least a leash for the deemed universities? What's your take on that? To Amrit and to be supported with Doctor.
Ultimately, sir, we are talking about accountability and autonomy as mutually exclusive when they need not actually be so. And this is also about probably the principle or the theory of competing rights. If the students have a fundamental right to primary education is there, higher education is yet to be officially made a fundamental right in the constitution, but Supreme Court has stressed upon higher education also as one of the rights that students will enjoy in most of their judgments. And on the other hand, you have the Article 19(1)(g), which is about the freedom of trade, profession and occupation. When you have competing rights, discretion is what balances the whole thing. And you very rightly pointed out that the Yashpal committee report did take a sort of an extreme stance that deemed universities should be scrapped and done away with, which is not possible in a country like this. Of course, we do live in a country where higher education is still thought of as a privilege, but privilege on the student's part. But on the educational institution's part, higher education has always been thought of as a charitable privilege. This is the difference in perception and in impression management that we give to countries abroad. And ultimately, when it comes to quality, the TMA Pai judgment admits that when you come to infrastructure in higher education, teachers, quality of students, there is a cost attached to it. There is a price attached to it. And this, of course, when it is misused, the regulators will have to take care of it. That's why there has been a lot of litigation between competing regulators in the same field. And what is going to occupy the field is the field of discretion. Ultimately, what the courts say will occupy the field. Regulators, of course, have their role, and it is not wise to look at the whole issue in binaries. There are shades of gray. And in the shades of gray, we will have to live in the lighter side where private initiative is welcome, because the courts have admitted, government has also admitted that, yes, we are not able to fund higher education in India like the way primary education has been managed. And I'm sure that Dr. Vaidya will also add to this question.
Yeah. See, picking from where Amrit left, see, there are good and bad in both types of universities. There are good state universities and bad state universities. And likewise, there are good private universities, deemed universities, and there are bad ones also. So all these new rules are coming not because of any absence in rules. There are enough rules, regulations, acts by state governments that can prevent this type of malpractice in the system. The lack of will to enforce these is what is surprising. So it is not absence of guidelines or rules or regulations. For example, every state has a capitation fee act. And I have not known so far that an institution has been hauled for collecting capitation fee. And the entire tandem committee exercise was pursuant to an attempt to capitate a student. Nobody asked the question that time, why was the State Capitation Fee Act not enforced? Why a separate tandem committee is necessary? So the fundamental question, one, is when the UGC Act treats universities and deemed universities same as Section 2 of the Act for all practical purposes, why is there a need for a special rules, special provisions, a special regulations for deemed universities that other universities don't have? Second, the more and more the freedom is given to universities, the more and more they are accountable. There is no denial in that. So the role of the government is to give that freedom and monitor the progress of institutions. It cannot simply control and keep on strangulating things and make it more and more stricter on one hand, and on the other hand expect universities to progress. Both cannot happen simultaneously. So the role of the government is to give the freedom and monitor and implement rules, regulations that are already in place. That will must be forthcoming.
Wonderful, sir. Well taken. Well taken. So now another question to you, again taken from the chat. I mean, I'm only articulating it and putting it in a... See, sir, I will take it this way. You were, in your speech, you were saying about self-financing colleges, how it caters to the underprivileged and it empowers the underprivileged also. Of course, I'm at the same page with you. I believe everyone will be at the same page with you, that self-financing colleges, its conception, at the inception or in the initial stages, were fantastic, they're fabulous. In fact, I have to also confess that in 1986, when I passed out of St. Anthony's Tanjore, I wanted to apply for Sastra. I don't know whether it is a blessing or a curse. I lost the seat. I couldn't get the seat. But what I wanted to say is, today, after so many years, after we are looking after 35 years or so, 35 years, yes. the kind of, as you rightly pointed out, after the mushrooming of so many self-financing colleges, which literally declined the value of professional education. In fact, we read in newspapers that we had a lakh plus of seats vacant in engineering colleges in Tamil Nadu, which was a very sorrow sight. Once, which was looked upon by myself as a privilege or a honor, it was diluted in such a way, it was very pathetic for me. And even that self-financing concept or a private college concept, by allowing it to be mushroomed without any proper regulation in numbers, in quality, in whatever metrics it has to be, has seen a complete erosion of, I mean, I would say definitely there is an erosion. And today I can't myself call an engineering profession unless it is from the greatest institutions as a professional degree. I would rate that, I mean, some of the arts are much preferred. BCom graduates at places are more preferred than BE graduates. This is a hard truth or a ground reality I want you to address. That being the case, likewise, this allowing deemed universities just because we need 1,500 without a regulation, without a proper perimeter, boundary, will it not lead to a deterioration which we are seeing in the past a decade or so? And what is your take on that? And what are the things? Do you still feel that the quality of education in the private sector would be much more superior than the than if it is in the public hands?
Well, quick response. The proliferation of the self-financing engineering colleges happened between 2000 and 2010. Because till 2000, as I said before, it was a very calibrated growth that was demand driven. And then people felt that, there is going to be a never-ending demand for engineering graduates. And that's when we saw a lot of self-financing engineering colleges coming up between 2000 and 2010. In fact, the deemed universities itself, it was till 2004 that the process of deemed university was very stringent. It was very methodological. There were different milestones that institutions had to achieve before being conferred as a deemed university. Then it was like after 2004, in fact, I wrote a very incisive piece on this. Deemed universities were given, a conditional deemed university status was given, that you are a deemed university, but please make sure that in the next 3 years or 5 years, you satisfy these conditions. In fact, institutions till 2003, those who are deemed universities are permanent deemed universities. Those that were given after 2004, most of them were given on a conditional basis. In fact, I jocularly used to say that you give a driving license to somebody and ask them to learn driving within 1 year. On that condition, they gave the driving license. So that's how deemed university status was given after 2004. And when we got the deemed university status, it was very stringent. Now, this proliferation is because of very poor policy making. It was not demand driven. And that's why, as I pointed out earlier, it was very polarized also. It was not scattered across the country. 5 states offered almost 80% of the engineering education. And this realization dawned very late as 2 years back. And then they decided to stop giving approval for new colleges unless it is government or there is enough statistics to support a demand for engineering education. And market forces are also like that. The market is getting intelligent. Parents don't want their wards to go and join a third-rate engineering college, but rather they know that if they go to a very good, as you rightly said, arts and science or BCom, which is no way inferior at all. They are giving better jobs also. So there is now good market competition, not only amongst engineering colleges, but between engineering colleges as well as other types of institutions. And that is why engineering institutions are also getting very interdisciplinary in the way in which they impart education to their students. So moving forward, market forces will decide, and it will clearly separate the good from the bad. And my estimate is that the demand for good institutions will continue to be there. It cannot happen that engineering education, that professional graduates from engineering colleges will dwindle in number as we move forward. No, quality institutions will only keep on increasing.
In fact, just to add, to take a minute with JK's permission, the 2010 UGC regulations, when they were challenged before the Madras High Court, it was a huge matter where I think 12 learned senior counsel appeared, and the matter went on for a long time. And the judgment of the single judge clearly made a distinction, a debatable distinction between those universities which are created by the government by statute and the deemed universities by executive charter by notification. And the judgment was to the effect that whatever happens, university is not equal to deemed university.
Oh.
This was the equation that was attempted in the judgment of the learned single judge in 2010. And ultimately, the judgment was stayed by the division bench because it was in the teeth of the TMA Pai judgment. So, when you spoke about quality, or whether the quality of education in X institution, Y institution is better or best, the perception that persists that in fact these colleges or government universities can deliver on these points, whereas private universities may not be able to, or private universities are better here, or there is some laxity here. There is a need to be more practical, especially when viewing it from a legal perspective, and to approach it strictly on the basis of the regulations and on the basis of the judgments. This is just adding on to what has been already been said.
Fine. So there's a fine question by Mr. Subramaniam. He says, he's asking rather, from the student's perspective, he says, how well are the Indian universities equipped to address the employment challenges in future? And he also adds, he also says that there is a grim picture where by 2025, it is projected that over 50% of the jobs will be lost to automation, or rather artificial intelligence, AI. Is an education policy required in this regard to regulate the education process so as to, the employment challenges are dealt with? To you, sir.
Yeah, he rightly pointed out the emerging areas that is popularly called as Industry 4.0, the way in which engineering education is also aligned to the growing demands of Industry 4.0, and of course, institutions are also beginning to realign their course curriculum in that direction. So at the same time, I also would like to highlight that the contribution of these higher education institutions in the last 20 years needs to also be looked with a sense of positivism, because even today, somebody keeps talking about the NASSCOM McKinsey report of 2003, which says, 25% of the engineering graduates are employable. And still people keep quoting about this. And still even the IT industry quotes about this. I'm very, it's very unfortunate that the IT industry is also celebrating this report. Do they think that, in the last 15 years, engineering graduates, there was no value addition in the engineering graduate output that saw the growth of IT industry in the last 15 years? No. So institutions are also responding to the changing paradigms of the industry in their own calibrated manner, and progressive privates respond in a faster manner. Autonomous public institutions like the IITs also respond in a faster manner. So it is depending on what type of institutions we are and how we respond to the fast changing demands of the industry, that institutions can differentiate themselves. So moving forward, only institutions that can differentiate themselves will be able to survive in this competitive higher education orbit that meets the demands of the competitive workspace. As he rightly pointed out, 50% of the jobs will not be there by 2025 because of the changing ways. Today we see disruption happening in online space. Likewise, Mr. Chandrasekharan of Tata Sons uses this word. We are moving from digital to phygital. So we are going to get phygital campuses, physical infrastructure and digital ecosystem. This is going to get combined. So moving forward, those institutions that realize the advancing trends of workplace will definitely do a good job than those that have a laid-back attitude.
Thank you, sir. Sir, another question. What would be your take on the Foreign Universities Bill 2010? I want you to touch upon that also. Why? Because, see, in the last decade or so, we have seen there is a great exodus, not on the brain drain on employment, but there is a brain drain on seeking higher education for research, for masters. People are, there is a surge there is a very big surge and a spike in the number of students who are going out of India to Europe, to US and everywhere for higher education, be it research or anything.
Yeah.
And this foreign universities bill, whether it will have an impact on both ways, and talking about both ways, one, on the exodus, will it have an impact, or foreign universities coming into India and setting up establishments here, will it have an impact on the domestic education, on the domestic private players, or even the government players, and also on the forex? What would be the forex impact on that? Yes,
See,
that would be to you, doctor.
Yeah, in 2010, when this bill was at the draft stage, I wrote an article titled, Foreign University Bill, an Unprescribed Bill. Because that time the fundamental premise that was made was that if foreign universities come to India, the annual outflow of $8 billion because of students leaving India for graduate or PhD work outside will stop. But then I was also part of a delegation that went to Washington as part of the bilateral dialogue between India and US. And I asked a few questions to the foreign universities, which I don't want to name. And I asked them, if this bill comes, will you come to India? Not one was very confidently telling that, yes, they're going to come to India. So what type of institutions will come to India through the foreign university bill is anybody's guess. We are not going to have the Caltech or the MITs coming up and setting up campuses in India. So on the other hand, assuming that they will come, is it going to stop students leaving India? No, definitely not. Because the way in which the graduate education, the PhD education is all built needs further improvement in our country. People go outside for certain unique experience that they get in Europe or US, as you mentioned, which is completely missing here in India. So if we are able to change that ecosystem that supports this type of a unique experience within India, nothing is going to stop these students from going to US or other places for graduate or PhD education. So in my view, foreign university bill, thankfully it did not take off, but unless there is a level playing field, you cannot have foreign universities come here and enjoy all the freedom that even Indian institutions don't enjoy. So unless you have a level playing field, then a foreign university bill is not welcome. That's my personal view. And secondly, only if good universities come, will it have an impact on the outflow of foreign exchange. If not so good universities come and set up campuses and offer conventional degree programs, that is not going to stop students from going there to do MS or PhD in cutting edge areas in US or Europe. So the difference is in what type of universities, and secondly, whether there's going to be a level playing field for Indian institutions to compete with foreign universities.
Fine, sir. That's well taken. There's also another question from Mr. Vishwanathan, one of our very important bar member. He asked, will the argument in support of the grant of freedom to deemed universities give room for socio-imbalancing, that only creamy layers will go up, leaving the economically downtrodden left back? I would like either of you to take the question, sir.
Briefly, to answer this first with Dr. Vaidya's permission, this is more of an ethical dilemma that in fact was running in every student's mind. It runs in every student's mind even now, that how are educational institutions going to serve the cause of equality? These are debates in idealism which have to be met somewhere, and they have to be met through the ideals pragmatically enshrined in the Constitution about quality education, about the higher education, the freedom that is accorded to them, and balanced with an ethical approach both by the regulators and by the deemed universities together. This will be a joint effort, because leaving aside a section of society, the nation cannot progress. But at the same time, for the cause of quality, certain sacrifices have been made by this country. So looking at all of this, there's only one point. Are we as Indian students and parents willing to spend the amount of money, take loans on higher education the way it is done in the US? This is a very fundamental question, because the question touches upon behavioral patterns. This is a question that has no easy answers and will be asked for times to come.
Very
Just
well
adding a
answered, sir.
small
Thank
point,
you.
adding
Yes, sir.
one small point, the issue of inclusivity in a different perspective. I can talk on behalf of Shastra. What we have done is, when many of the universities celebrate the fact that uh, students from all over the country come and study there. In fact, some deemed universities say that 70% of the students are from outside their home state, and they celebrate that. But we took a different view on that to make it more responsive to the local community and be more inclusive. We have reserved 10% seats each to Trichy and Tanjavur students. 10% to Trichy, 10% to Tanjavur, and then 50% to Tamil Nadu, and the remaining 30% on an all India basis. To that extent, we are more responsive to the local needs, so that the students within the vicinity of our university get the opportunity to study at Shastra. Not because they're born there. So some of them would have been born in Trichy and then they go study elsewhere in Bombay and then come back. So not on a domicile basis. 10th and 12th, they should study in the Tanjavur or Trichy district. Then they get access to this 10% stream. So this way we address the issue of inclusivity to include students within the immediate neighborhood and make it more inclusive.
Fine, sir. Sir, another question to you, Doctor. Aside from the quality of education and scientific integrity, which tends to be different between Indian and foreign, particularly European and American universities, what is your opinion on the role of politics or power hierarchical structures that tend to anchor Indian academia for betterment? How can this be addressed or improved in a large scale?
The second part is a loaded question, but I'll answer the first part. The what is missing is the thirst for hunting the best of the faculty, hire them at any cost, and give them all the supportive infrastructure, invest in them. On those dimensions, definitely the North American universities and the majority of the European universities excel Indian institutions. So we need a paradigm shift in the way in which we hire our faculty, we retain them, we are able to attract investments, we are able to build corpus and support long-term research. Because academic institutions are supposed to be the fountainhead for basic research. And it is a long gestation period that only a few institutions can afford to invest in this type of work. So we need that type of institutions to make us comparable with the West. Of course, there is a lot of interference. I wouldn't say politics, but government interference in the day-to-day affairs of education institutions has to be minimized so that the output is maximized. So enough freedom must be given, and I think it has realized, it is realized by those in power now, and that's why we see certain few regulations like the graded autonomy regulations, the NIRF ranking, giving them freedom to top 100 institutions. So it started to just show up. And as we move forward, the more and more progressive institutions are given more freedom, the more and more they can excel and face the competition at a global level.
Thank you, Doctor. By the way, that is a question by Gayatri Jaikumar, my daughter from Zurich.
So ETH, so all I want is...
She is from ETH.
The freedom that ETH in Zurich enjoys, if it is given to institutions like us...
She has joined to listen to you.
You wouldn't be surprised 25 years from now, we'll also become the ETH contemporaries here.
Thank you, Doctor. And now I would request Prithvi to unmute Mr. V.S. Jayakumar, who has probably the last question of the session. And over to you, Mr. Jayakumar. Prithvi, please unmute V.S. Jay.
Yeah, good evening. See, I found the Google, there are 251 state universities, and there are 130 deemed universities, and 30 of them are in Chennai. Instead of amending the UGC Act of 1956, why don't you have a deemed university act? You'll have so much of flexibility. Because High Court is observing it's not equal to university. There are a lot of restrictions. Why do you want to depend on UGC for everything when you can have an independent act, and that'll give a stature to you internationally? You can conduct online courses. You can give certificate, which is virtually, there's a lot of mileage. And last year I went to Coventry University near London. I could do a course for only one day and I could get a certificate from the university. So what is the authenticity of online courses and one-day courses? If you can consider this as part of the Deemed University Act, I'm sure you'll get a better mileage. I hope I'm clear of what I'm asking to you.
To add to before, I want to supplement my namesake. This is not the question to the speakers, to VSJ himself. Why at all we need that prefix as a deemed university is my question.
I agree. Because I'm a tax lawyer, I'm a little bugged about fiction, deemed.
No, that's what. When there is a deemed manufactured in central excise, we never call that product as deemed manufactured. We said manufactured. When there is a deemed GST, after it is only to conceive. After it is conceived and it is deemed, it takes a parent character. It becomes the product by itself. So after you satisfy all these norms, become deemed, then why you have to characterize it as deemed and why you have to prefix it? That is my question. Okay, over to you, Doctor.
The Radhakrishnan Commission went on to say that once the institutions are declared as deemed universities, over a period of time, they should be converted into the regular university status. So that was the recommendation that was given. I distinctly remember in 2001, when 3 deemed universities in Tamil Nadu was fighting against the state government in the single window system, I was briefing the legendary senior advocate Mr. Habibullah Basha on this. I explained to him on why this deemed university came. This deeming fiction was originated only to be extinguished over a period of time. But the extinguishing process has not started. And Mr. Jayakumar, I am fighting so hard to only bring a very small amendment in section 23 of the UGC Act that is not happening. But you are asking me to come with a separate act itself. So you realize how hard my fight should get to have a separate act for deemed universities itself. It's a very, very...
So if you ask for the moon, you will get stars.
Huh?
If you ask for the moon, you will get stars.
No, sir, you ask for the stars, you get the moon.
If you get the stars, you get only cinema stars.
Yeah. Secondly, on the move to online, you see, I will just answer that. See, online education needs to be encouraged. But the regulations from UGC is very funny. I wrote about this also. They say, unless online degrees require a regular pedigree. So you can offer online programs only if you offer those programs in the regular mode. I find this regulation to be a joke. And I have been constantly pleading, saying that, you should offer online courses in contemporary areas, certificate courses. You need not necessarily offer them in the regular format. As long as you have faculty who can offer it in the online format, it has to be encouraged. So I think the government is now looking at that direction. And in the Atmanirbhar of the project that was announced, the finance minister had said that 100 universities, top universities will be offering online programs. And I think the UGC is ready to come out with its notification that will empower 100 universities to offer online degree programs, certificate programs without the need to get prior approval from UGC. The day is not far.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. And I would request AP Srinivas, our Dhoni of our Madras Tax Bar, to come and what to say. He also has something to supplement on this question, and thereafter take thanking honors. And in fact, once again, sir, there is a chant from Mr. Vishwanathan. Actually, when I asked Prithvi, I was told that he doesn't want to ask and asked me to ask. There is a confusion. Vishwanathanji, you want to ask this, add or amend the question I asked on your behalf? He's raising his thing. Sir, just a minute, doctor. I'll just unmute Mr. Vishwanathan before we go to AP Srinivas. And AP Srinivas will supplement this question and conclude the session.
Sir, it was great learning for me. I really enriched my knowledge with your both of you. And I know that Amit Bhargav is there for me to answer any question. I can privately contact him also on any universities and all that. See, our university, the term education has been a matter of litigation before the Supreme Court, you may be aware. My question to you, sir, is on the foreign universities. Some foreign universities amalgamate and come to India. There are some amalgamations with the local educational bodies and their colleges here. But the difficulty was they were not recognized as deemed universities also. Then they have to go for some approval. They were finding AICTE and all that. why is this confusion? Why there is no clear policy on who will be recognized as a deemed university or as an AICTU? Why there is difference? Why classification is it not clear or what? I just want you to address that.
Okay,
Between deemed universities and AICTU, what is the difference? Where one has to go for approval? If it is a foreign collaborated educational institution, where they have to get the approval?
No, actually, there is reasonable classification, competent authorities to confer status of deemed university, and for other standalone institutions, there are statutory bodies and regulatory mechanisms on the issue of approval. The foreign university, in fact, my father was personally involved in this. He filed the PIL. You know, for some fly-by-night foreign universities in the late 90s, you know, kind of collaborated with the training centers here. I don't want to name them, and started franchising their degrees in India. And that created a lot of issues, and they were not recognized by any of the statutory bodies in India. And that's when foreign university bill was later suggested. That's a different story. But there are enough competent authorities, regulatory mechanisms that cannulate the process of starting new institutions, giving them approval. So there is no confusion. The only thing is there is too much of regulation. So that needs to be addressed. So AICT is a statutory body for engineering and management education. NCT is for teacher education, MCA for medical education, Bar Council of India for legal education. So these are the various statutory bodies that are responsible for different streams of education, and they are all in place.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Over to you, APS.
And on GST, I just wanted to clarify, the tuition fee we collect has no GST.
Yes, correct.
Only up to high school, there is no GST on the auxiliary educational services. For higher education, auxiliary educational services also, we have to pay the GST.
Correct.
We run it ourselves. So we have to run our own buses, we have to run our own hostels, and we have to run everything ourselves. Then there is no GST.
Yes.
On one hand, in fact, I used to appeal before the finance minister. On one hand, you want us to become world-class universities. On the other hand, to claim GST, we also have to run our own buses. So should we become a bus operator or world-class university is a question.
Maybe you have to also explore the concept of composite supply and try to get it sandwiched with the education tuition fees and try to get a exemption if it is possible. Anyway, sir, over to you, APS, and with your thanking remarks. Thank you.
I just wanted to supplement this also. This is precisely explained by the National Academy Training Center. NACIN has issued a bulletin specifically for this educational institutions with explaining what is auxiliary service and what is ancillary services. The core educational service alone is exempted from GST. Otherwise, the standard rate of 18% is applicable. In fact, even their campus recruitment charges labeled GST. So that's what I think some issue is going on this. Some light will be thrown in the years to come. Yes, sir. Of course, I thank Mr. Dr. S. Vaidya Subramaniam and young speaker, Mr. Amrit Bhargav, who is one among from us. And Mr. Dr. S. Vaidya Subramaniam is well known to us. He is a professional speaker and he has given address in various forums and has written many articles, including the subject which he spoken today. And Mr. Amrit Bhargav is a rising youngster from our tax bar, and he is attached with learned additional advocate general, Mr. Aravind Pandian, and who also did well. And Mr. Jaykumar in the role of moderator, he extremely did well, and he naturally allied with both the speakers and turned out to be a very good session today. And both Mr. Dr. S. Vaidya Subramaniam and Mr. Amrit Bhargav today traced the origin of education institution itself right from the Dr. Radhakrishnan committee from the year 1949, and they have touched all the committee reports and as well as the judgments in the chronological order up to the Orissa Lift Irrigation Society case. Of course, the Orissa Lift Irrigation Society case is concerned with the degrees given by the distance education universities. Of course, the Supreme Court came to decided the larger issue by interpreting Section 23. And of course, again, that Section 23 was the problem in the recent judgment whether the Prevention of Corruption Act will applicable to deemed universities also. So again, Section 23. One way the Section 22 of the UGC Act permits them to give certificates, award degrees. And the problem is in Section 23 only. So Section 23 says, as of now, only the central and state governments can use the word universities and not any corporate or not the like. So there the problem lies only in 23. So if simply Section 23 is amended, it will solve the problem. So one way you have allowed them to award degrees, then by which name they have to award? Now they cannot go to any mother university or Trichy university. They have to depend on their own name only. So therefore, the amendment to Section 23 will solve the issue, and a separate deemed university act is not necessary. Of course, UGC has given various guidelines into that, including recognizing those deemed universities degrees act in the year 2010 itself. So that was their precise question before the Supreme Court in the review petition also. Of course, they lost. I think soon act will be amended, and this the status of deemed universities and their prestige will be restored so that they can also compete globally. And I thank once again Mr. Dr. Vaidya Subramaniam and young speaker Mr. Amrit Bhargav and our moderator come speaker Mr. JK. He did an excellent job today. And I thank honorable judges who have participated with.
So I think there's some.
Okay, I'll just want to conclude only with 2 words before Prithvi you close. I just wanted to say only 2 words. I think APS is back.
Yes.
APS, you can finish it.
Additional Advocate General from our Madras High Court, then senior counsels and central government and state government officers, various standing councils were part of us with today, especially UGC standing councils and AICT and UPC councils are also with us. And members of our MTB and other various bars, I thank. I think Mr. JK, you wanted to say.
Just 2 words. See, we always call after a betrothal before marriage, up to marriage, we always call as husband to be and wife to be, something like that. I think the time has come that to be has to be merged and become a proper husband and wife. There is no to be is required henceforth. I wish and pray that day happens very soon, and all the best to doctor for that. And a special mention to Amrit. I have to tell you, Amrit, from today, I haven't seen you spoken in any of these sessions, but from today, you will have a very lasting impact on me. You have been a wonderful, wonderful diction. What a wonderful presentation. I'm so honored to have you both on board. Thank you, sirs. It was a privilege. And thank you all the audience for gathering for this wonderful session. Thank you, sirs.
Thanks a lot for the opportunity.
Stay safe. Good day.
Thank you.
Over to you, Prithvi.
Thank you all. Thank you all for joining us today. So enough words have already been spoken in thanking our speakers for today by APS sir and JK sir. And I thank once again for taking out the time to give this wonderful session today. And I thank all the participants also for joining us. We will be uploading this session in our YouTube channel, Madras Tax Bar Chennai. You can, whenever it's uploaded, the link will be shared, and you can always catch up with this session as and when you desire to. So thank you once again for joining us. Take care of your health, stay home and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you, sirs.
Thank you very much.